We knew what a one bedroom unit layout needed to look like, what a two bedroom unit layout needed to look like, studios, etc. The difference is in the timber itself, and so
Well, hey folks, welcome back to another Timber Talk Tuesday. I'm Ricky McLean with WoodWorks. Type 4B construction is one of the new tall mast timber construction types introduced in the 2021 International Building Code. And we've seen quite a bit of interest in projects in the 8 to 12 story range using Type 4B construction in multifamily occupancies. So I recently had a conversation with John Mitchell of Hartshorne Plunkard Architecture. Now, John is no stranger to mass timber project design. He's worked on projects such as T3 in Atlanta, the Fulton Market project in Chicago, as well as the Nashville Warehouse project. But the intro project in Cleveland is the one we're going to talk about today, and one of their first mass timber multifamily projects. So in this conversation, we talked about the differences and similarities between tall multifamily design using mass timber versus using other traditional construction materials. We talked about things like grid differences and how they align with a parking structure below. We also talked quite a bit about the amount of timber that was exposed on intro, as it did exceed the limits for Type 4B construction, how they chose what was exposed, and how they ultimately got that approved by the city of Cleveland. So let's jump over to that conversation that I had with John Mitchell of HPA. All right, John. Well, thanks for coming on. Wanted to discuss the intro project, one of the first tall mass timber multifamily projects that we've seen here in the U.S. with 8 stories of mass timber construction over a single story above grade podium. And I know you and your firm has quite a bit of multifamily design experience in the past, but predominantly with concrete construction. So I was wondering if you could first introduce what was different and similar about this as a tall mass timber multifamily project, programmatic layout wise, relative to how you would normally do a tall concrete, say, multifamily project.
Yeah, Ricky. So absolutely, there's some similarities and there are differences. And I guess I'll start with the similarities in that a multifamily residential building, and we've got a lot of experience doing that in concrete and steel. I mean, that's how we butter our bread, essentially. And so there are planning principles that apply for a multifamily residential project, regardless of the construction type. The units have to lay out. If the units don't lay out, then it's really not a successful project, particularly ones that are market rate residential. Those principles, we started with that. We knew what a one bedroom unit layout needed to look like, what a two bedroom unit layout needed to look like, studios, etc. The difference is in the timber itself. And so working with the suppliers and with the structural engineer and learning more about planning modules. Like a concrete building, a great module is about 27 to 30 feet for a structural bay, because that allows you to squeeze a one bedroom unit in one structural bay. And then down below, when you have the parking, you can squeeze 3 spaces in between columns. And so it stacks very nicely. Timber's more of like a 20-foot bay, plus or minus. And so learning to adapt the structural grid for that was probably the biggest difference. In the end, I do feel like it works either way. There's just ways of adapting it for whatever the construction type is.
Right. And speaking of construction type, I know this was Type 4B construction, one of the new types introduced in the 2021 code. And I know something that you had to address on this project was the exposure limits that Type 4B has. Prescriptively, you're limited to 20% exposed ceilings. Intro did achieve more than that. So maybe talk through a second, what was your approach to determining how much exposed timber would be desirable, how that kind of affected the unit layout where you had exposed timber versus not, and then also what the conversation with the city was like to get approval?
Sure. Yeah. So from a coverage standpoint, it began with what would what did the client want to have from an exposure standpoint? And the short answer is as much as possible. But then we looked at a typical unit layout and just analyzed it based on what's going to be covered regardless. I mean, bathrooms were dropping ceilings. Some of those back of house areas were dropping ceilings regardless. And so using that as our starting point, obviously this was a very long conversation with the city of Cleveland and their building department. Over the course of 18 months, we pitched what we'd like to do, and there was a dialogue back and forth, and ultimately where we ended up was right around 50% coverage, which is more than what Type 4B allows. And that was a series of analyses and, for lack of a better term, trade-offs, in that there was enhanced egress capacity and fire ratings for the egress components. The stair and elevator towers are all non-combustible construction. There's added protection on the corridors, and so that became part of the trade-off for that increase in exposure. But as far as how that compares to, let's say, like a concrete building, there's going to be drop ceilings in bathrooms and back of house areas anyway in a concrete building. And so the delta ultimately wasn't really that much more drywall coverage for this particular timber building.
Got it. And you said about 50%, which, by the way, we've heard is I think kind of the sweet spot for multifamily, because of exactly what you said. You're just going to have some protection or drop ceilings in certain areas. But I was curious, did that 50%, was that just ceiling, or did you also have any exposed beams, any exposed columns?
Yeah, so all the columns are exposed, unless they're buried in demising walls or plumbing walls or things like that. This is primarily a ceiling and beam, 50%. The columns were more or less excluded from that calculation.
Got it. Okay. Perfect. Well, John, thank you very much for having this conversation. I think this is a construction type 4B, especially in multifamily, where we're going to see quite a bit more growth. And your project intro has been really a precedent setter for that. So thank you for sharing your insights today.
Thanks, Ricky. My pleasure.
Well, there you have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with John. It's exciting to see Intro near completion. They actually are expected to host one of the NBA All-Star Game festivities in the winter of 2022 as part of the event space on the top floor of the Intro project in Cleveland. So I thank you so much for watching today's video, and until next time, we'll see you later.